Hey everyone, it's Dr. B, and this is the Generational Differences series where we're going to be talking about generational differences in the workforce. And this particular class is called Values in the Workplace, a Thing of the Future, Part 1. All right, so this is section 1, and we're going to be talking about values. What are values? Values are a person's principles or standards of behaviors, one's judgments of what's important in life. We all have values. There's no way around thinking that we all share exactly the same values, and yet we have to work together in a work environment. So it's so important to be able to talk about our values in a respectful and thoughtful way at work. Now we're going to shift over and talk about generations. This is the fun stuff. So there are actually 5 generations in the workforce currently. Really, the traditionalists have pretty much pulled them, they're out of the workforce. And Gen Z is just now starting to enter the workforce and become a real player in as a generation in the working community. So let's talk about and define what generations mean. There's Gen Z. They're born between 1996 and 2015. Millennials, they're really prominent in the workforce now and starting to lead in the managerial positions. And millennials were born in 1977 to 1995. Okay, I'm a Gen Xer. That is my face. It says inclusion on my hat. We like everybody to be included, but we can be a little bit independent and feisty this generation because in the middle of millennials and baby boomers, we are the smallest generation. Gen X is only about 46 million people. Millennials are about 82 million people. Baby boomers are about 78 million people. So you can see we're a small generation between two very large generations. Baby boomers are born between 1946 and 1964. This is Robert De Niro. If you haven't seen the movie The Intern, it's a great representation of a relationship between a mentor and a millennial who's running a new startup company. And it really illustrates how there is this huge transition in the modern workforce. Last but not least, we have Tony Bennett. He's a traditionalist. He also partners with a younger person, Lady Gaga, not a millennial, however, a Gen Xer, and they work together in the music industry some of the time, not all the time, obviously, but they have that mentoring coaching relationship when they do concerts together. Traditionalists are born before 1945, and they've shifted very much so out of the workforce. However, what lingers is their legacy of policies and procedures that are now in massive transformation in terms of generational differences. How do we shape a generation? It's so interesting, and people just think, oh, I'm part of a different generation, and it doesn't mean, there's nothing really specific about it. But in reality, there are 3 key parts to every single generation that defines a generation. So it's parenting, technology, and economics. And how those 3 things intersect are what create the values and the visions of a particular generation. So interesting. So computers came into being. That was a big invention in terms of defining a generation. The Twin Towers being attacked on 9/11, that's a crisis event that impacted so many parts of our lives that it impacted and determined the perception of an entire generation. And then parenting, I love this picture because it's a parent bubble wrapping a kiddo in order to go out into the world. Well, Gen Z, you're going to hear at the end of this that Gen X, was very much an independent generation, and we were kind of left to our own devices and to take care of ourselves. But then as parents, we became the bubble wrap helicopter parents who then said, oh no, we're never going to leave our kiddos alone. And they're going to have a cell phone with them all the time. And so that parenting has shifted the way millennials perceive and operate in the workforce and the world as a generation. So we're talking about values. We're talking about generational differences and values in the workforce. So let's first define the top 10 values that are prevalent today in our culture. We are talking about things like gun violence. We're talking about COVID-19 as a global pandemic. We're talking about racial inequity. We're talking about income gaps. We're talking about climate change. Gen Z, interestingly, one of their top priorities and interest areas and concerns are about food insecurity and hunger across their generation and other generations. We're talking about LGBTQ rights. Millennials are particularly interested in voting rights and healthcare affordability and access, as well as public school quality and disparity. Now, I want you to take a really quick look at the second picture on this slide. Do you know what that is an image of? I'm going to give you a second. Pretty sure if you could scream through the screen at me that you would say, it's the COVID-19 molecule. And you would be absolutely right, because it is the COVID-19 molecule. And what's interesting is never before in history has this image been in our presence. We only have started to see this image since COVID-19 presented itself in 2019, 2020 to 2021. And now it's a dominant picture that nobody is unaware of what that picture looks like or what that picture means and how it's impacted all of our lives. So there will be, somebody said the other day, generations are named after a crisis event of their childhood. Well, and what will the next generation be called? It'll probably be called something like either the pandemic generation or the COVID-19 generation or something like that. However, we haven't named that generation yet. So with these things being very, very prevalent in the minds of the masses in the workforce, businesses have to adjust to being able to talk about and address values in relation to generational differences, in relation to how millennials view it versus how Gen X views it, versus how boomers view it, versus how Gen Z coming up also view it differently. All right, so let's do a really quick overview of what generational differences are and how they work. So first, we've already kind of gone through the years of what makes you fit into your generational category. However, what people don't realize is that there's an archetype to every generation. And that archetype is a repetitive process. And it repeats every 4 generations. So that means that traditionalists come under the heading of artist archetype. They conform to the benefits of society. That's their comfort zone. That's their value system. And they like face-to-face interactions. Baby boomers are the archetype prophet. And what they also like face-to-face interactions, but they're more competitive. They work for the betterment of their families from a working perspective. So baby boomers often, think, I'm going to work till I die. Now, that is not a shared value across generations, so it's important to recognize that. Gen X, remember, a very small generation under the archetype nomads. They value liberty, independence. They were raised as latchkey kids, unprotected, really kind of just raised themselves in so many ways, so they figure stuff out. Without the internet and without social media and without cell phones. So they're a pretty scrappy generation, but they also come across as an angry generation, even though, hello, I don't think of myself as angry all that often. They also prefer, because computers were a huge part that came into the mix during Gen X, that we actually feel pretty comfortable in an online environment, even though it's not necessarily our norm. We also feel very comfortable in the face-to-face environment. So I often see that Gen X is kind of like the bridge between boomers and millennials. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Millennials are the hero archetype, and the heroes are community-oriented. They're very influenced by affluence. So money is a driving force for millennials. They are very interested in technology and keeping up with technology. And guess what? They were raised by those kids who were unprotected and left to their own devices, then became their parents and then totally overprotected them. And so they were raised by overprotective parents, and what? Overprotective parents who wanted them to have every single thing they wanted. And so we often hear millennials are spoiled or entitled and all of these negative things. And at the same time, we don't give any consideration to why would that possibly be? Well, the one reason is, as parents, we told them you could do anything. You're so important. There's nothing more important than you. And so that is one of the important things that we just need to recognize about. We don't want to be judgmental of different generational differences and values and perspectives. We need to understand them in order to work together with these multi-generational workforces. They're very, very attached to their technology, which rightly so. Technology has been their whole lives. And they get mentoring online. They learn new things online. That's all easy for them. They're very great multitaskers, and millennials also coined a term called leisure time. They don't consider working or their leisure or off time as something separate. It's like, oh, I can get that work done while I'm hanging out at the beach with my friends. That's no big deal. Baby boomers are much more comfortable having their office space and their work more defined separately from their family or their free time. Millennials don't feel that way. We have to just recognize that that's a difference. Now, here's where it becomes very interesting. Generation Z, which is the youngest generation entering the workforce, are exactly like the traditionalists in terms of archetype, and they're repeating. So now there's the 80-year generational difference cycle is shifting, and we're back to artists. So again, this generation, Gen Z, is highly sensitive to the group, to conformity, to the best of what's good for everybody. They're compassionate, community focused, and however, they're not traditionalists. They did not grow up during the Great Depression. What they're growing up in is this technology and app world and the metaverse and just tons and tons of social media. In fact, there are named digital natives that technology is actually part of their body, rather than an object or something that we pick up and put down. And so they share, though, many of the same values and qualities that traditionalists have. They just do it in a 100-year later environment. And so that's what's interesting. The next generation, which will probably be called something like the COVID generation, is we call it currently the Alpha generation. And that's 2016, and they're recycling the prophet archetype. So they're going to share values and similarities to baby boomers. That repetitiveness is really important because while it on one hand makes us similar to past generations, it also makes us very different and hard to see that we're similar to past generations because of the time. Because when 80 years passes, you don't look back and go, oh yeah, 80 years ago. Well, most of us haven't lived on the planet for 80 years. By the time we're talking about 80 years ago, nobody's really listening anymore. So there are some generational takeaways where baby boomers and Gen X, we are next door neighbors to each other. There's a big transition in this shift of generations where baby boomers wore suits to work all day. That was their, and that's just how they were. Very formal work, and home was different. And Gen X came along and we're like, we run around in shorts. Like, okay, that's where Casual Friday came in. It was finally okay to wear jeans on Friday. Not every day, just on Friday. Millennials and Gen X are very similar also in many ways, particularly in the ways they communicate and their sort of comfort and casualness with each other. Millennials and Gen Z are similar in other ways. They're values driven by loyalty. They care about the values of the company that they work for and the organization that they work for. They will not work for a company that has values that are counter to their personal belief system. So important to know when hiring and trying to retain top talent. If your business is counter to the values of your workforce, you're probably not going to keep them. But nobody thinks that. We don't think about that, and we certainly don't talk about it. And when we don't talk about it, then it just feels like this out of control, I don't know who to hire, where are all the good employees, and blah, blah, blah. But we actually can understand it on a deeper level. Millennials are the largest group in the workforce right now. And more than anything, they never say it, and we never, people never ask them. But one of the most important things millennials need and want in their now often young management positions are mentoring and coaching from people who have wisdom of experience but lack the technology savvy that they have. So they want interpersonal relationships with colleagues that are older than them who have this wisdom, but they don't always have an opportunity because either their business doesn't have a structure for that, or they don't know how to ask for it. And the other generations who may have that skill set for them don't necessarily know that that's what they want, and so don't offer it. Okay, so there was a millennial post and I found it really, really funny. And so I wanted to share it with you because this speaks very much to how we don't think a whole lot about the differentiation between different generations, this 20-year period of time that people really fundamentally have a grab bag of values and ideas about the world that are different than the previous 20-year generation or the post 20-year generation. But this was a millennial post, and here's what it says. I don't mess around with anyone over 47, a Gen X or a boomer. They're built differently. Their families had them formally trained in something by the time they were 2. They had keys to their house by the time they were 5, could cook a full meal by the age of 7, were self-sufficient by the age of 9. They left the house at dawn every summer morning and didn't come home until nightfall. Survived all day on water from the garden hose and might get a sandwich if, by chance, someone's parents had gone shopping. They spent 3/4 of their lives by themselves with a parent checking in on them maybe twice a month. Most have evaded at least one kidnapping attempt. They know 15 ways to remove blood stains from clothing. Okay, so Gen X, when you read that from a millennial and as a Gen Xer, I think, oh my gosh, that's so absolutely true. And at the same time, I think I would be terrified of me thinking a young millennial thinks of me like that. I think, okay, I would be scared of Gen Xers. And at the same time, what Gen X is a scrappy generation, but we love to help other generations. We love to help other people. And we've figured out a lot of strategies for doing that. So the idea of having coaching and mentoring within the workforce across generations is so important, because what millennials lack in technology skills, they have in practical real life experience. And what millennials and younger generations have in technology, social media, and just skill sets, that's something that they can also share with Gen X. And so it makes an opportunity to have a really power team when we put it together in a way that is a win-win for all generations in the workforce. And we start to understand each other's values and recognize where they connect, rather than just disconnect and feel completely misunderstood. 77 Gen Z respondents in one Deloitte study said they considered it important to work for a company whose values align with theirs. Okay, I want you to look at these people here. The green folks, that's 77 people. The blue folks, that's 23% of the people. All right, if 77% of the people expect to work at a company that shares their values, but the 23% the 23 people are the ones in charge and don't know that the 77 are only going to stay if their values align with that company, they're not going to be able to retain talent. So it's really important to understand how to cross-communicate these things that are important in the workforce related to generation, because the likelihood is that the 23 people, the blue folks on that little image, are the ones who are more mature and in charge. And so if they don't understand the needs of the mass workforce working under them, then they're going to have a really hard time keeping people employed or attracting the most talented candidates. That was the end of section 1. Now join us at the start of section 2 on mental health awareness. Hey everyone, this is Dr. B. This is section 2 on mental health awareness and workplace changes. So 46% of the workforce are made up of millennials and Generation Z. So that's a good 150 million plus people in the workforce in those two generations. And what a lot of people, most people really don't understand is that each generation has an archetype, and that archetype defines the values of that generation to some degree. Of course, we have all sorts of other influences in our lives that make us who we are, and we're not all exactly the same just because we are a part of the same generation. However, being part of an archetype does define some of how we think about certain things over a period of time. So millennials and Gen Z are different archetypes. And as Gen Z hits the workforce, there's a massive transition of repeating the archetype cycle. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So the human capital and people pillar will make or break any business. And businesses that have been around for 100 years think, oh, we've made it through these challenges and this economic crisis and that, blah, blah, blah. However, what people don't realize is this shift is not just a shift. This is transformational. Gen Z has expectations of their companies, the companies that they work for. So interesting. I think this is I have a personal story about this, and it's interesting because I am the mother of a child who is part of the Gen Z group. and he happens to be a teacher. And he taught school last year. And then when it came time to say, are you going to renew your contract for next year in March, this came along. He said, no, I will finish out the school year, but I'm not going to come back to this organization. I'm not going to come back to this school because it didn't match his values and it didn't match his ideas of how he wanted to work. And this is the perfect example of how Gen Z is very different than other generations, particularly Gen X or baby boomers. You know, you don't quit a job until you have a new job. You don't, you have to prioritize your work over other things in your lives. But Gen Z, because of their experiences, they're like, this is who we are. We are different, and we prioritize our values and ourselves and what we need, because the world could end at any time because of experiences that they've had as children. Their crisis experience was the Twin Towers coming down, or 9/11, if you want to say it that way, that they are not willing to prioritize work over their lives fully, even though work is very important to them. But they have expectations of their employers, and that is that they have strong work ethics and ethics in general. They demonstrate actions that are consistent with those ethics. So they're not going to live one way at work and live another way at home. That's just not how they are built. They're living our values every day. That's what love means to them. So they express their values in action, and their values are front and center of a brand. So a short, quick example of that would be like, live their values at work. If it's not okay to be part of the LGBT community in a work environment, and even if a Gen Z person is an ally to the LGBT community, they're not going to work for a company that is unkind to that particular community. Or if there's not gender equity, or if there's not whatever the value happens to be, Gen Z is going to run it through and align it with their values. And if they're not in alignment, they're not necessarily going to stay. So we are in a workforce transformational changing crisis in some ways. There are going to be the biggest workforce shifts ever experienced in the last 100 years. So the largest generation, the largest two generations are just now starting to enter the workforce. That in and of itself is a huge shift. There's also this workforce including changes in values that are based on, remember, we talked about this before, parenting, the economy, and technology. So how generations were raised, how they were parented, impacts who they are as a worker, and the economy that they experienced, as well as the technology influences of their time and their upbringing. Those are the things that influence. And we all know, like, technology has taken over our lives, and we have mixed feelings about it. It's like the greatest, best thing in the whole world. And at the same time, sometimes people are like, let's get rid of all of technology. Neither will work. So we have to find middle ground. All right, as businesses are doing business, they have to invest in people in order to adapt to all these workforce changes. And this is not one of those things that they can kind of halfway commit to at this point in history. This is transformational. A 100-year period is a big shift. This is a four generational shift. So millennials and Gen Zs expect more equity, transparency, and mental health support than any generation before them. Let me say that again. If your business does not care about the mental health and well-being of the employees and their experience of work as well as the productivity of work, that work is not going to get done. And that work is not going to be successful, productive, or revenue producing for you. So because there are really good reasons for this. And the reasons are these two generations happen to know so much more about mental health than generations before. And they've been taught by their parenting, technology, and economy that it's okay to talk about mental health in the workplace or wherever because it is important and it impacts people's lives. Watch that implosion. Yikes. All right. So if we don't pay attention, or if you don't pay attention as an organization, company, or corporation to mental health in marketing, retention, recruiting strategies, then your business will potentially implode. I don't care if the business is a 200-year-old business. It cannot sustain this level of shift without addressing these transformative issues of bringing mental health into the workplace, with bringing in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, all into the workplace in ways that are meaningful. Bringing mental health and well-being into the workplace are all part of how people live now, and especially how younger generations expect and plan for their lives going forward. And work is just one part of their lives, unlike other generations where it was their lives. That was the end of section 2 on mental health awareness in the workplace. Hey everyone, it's Dr. B, and we're about to start section 3 of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Diversity is not something that we can ignore anymore. Generation Z is the most ethnically and racially diverse generation in history, and differences can't be put on the back burner anymore in the workplace or really in our communities or society. Diversity. Okay, so what does that mean? 53% of millennials identify as non-white. That means more than half of every group of 100 people identify as non-white, non-dominant culture. So that requires adjusting in the workplace, because before, a minority group didn't necessarily have the ability to impact change in an environment. Now today, what was once considered a minority group is now becoming the dominant culture, the dominant group. So 87% of millennials and Gen Z, when combined, identify diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes called DEI, as very important to them. That's 87%. That only leaves 13% where it's a zero. So, or not important to them, or not a priority to them. So again, like the other statistics before, if the 13 people out of 100 are the leadership, not really paying a whole lot of attention to diversity, difference, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, and they're making decisions about their organization from one very linear perspective, that impact is not going to be received well when the majority of the people in the organization actually identify from a different perspective, a perspective that is inclusive of difference. Transparency. We are not, there are generations that are much more private and much more quiet about things that happen at work compared to things that happen in other places. They just don't share information. How many people have signed a contract in their lives that say, I won't share what my salary is? Well, that day has come and gone and left us, because any organization that believes that millennials and Gen Z aren't going to talk about these kinds of things are just dead wrong. These are things that people talk about, because parents, remember, parenting has a big impact on the generation and how they view and value different things. And parents talked more to millennials and Gen Z children than any other generation before, but they also talked to their children about feelings, which is another thing. That whole idea of children being seen and not heard has been removed from our messaging and replaced with, let's talk about your feelings. And especially in families and parental and child relationships. So it's not surprising that actually millennials and Gen Zs feel closer to their parents than generations did in the past. Hello, remember the little clip about Gen X, who very rarely saw their parents? The other thing is that parents are more open about social justice issues in response to more diversity in the workforce and to situations that happen in society. We also have access to social media and just media in general that show us things happening that require a conversation, because they're complicated and they're confusing, and they have to do with race, and they have to do with sexual orientation, and they have to do with gender differences, and those things come down to fairness and equity that make people feel confused. And what happens when people get confused, especially young people, is that they need to talk about it. They need to sort through it. They need to communicate about it in order to understand it. And this is where the transparency comes in with these younger generations. They're not afraid to have conversations that are difficult and a little bit scary at times. You know, we don't know how to talk about something. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a clinical psychologist. I talk about all kinds of things all the time. And there are still topics that sometimes come up and I'm like, oh, wow, I need to have a minute with myself to think about how I want to have that conversation, because it's not my natural inclination to just share everything that's personal. But that's a fairly different way of processing with younger generations. Businesses that have ERGs, or employee resource groups, these have been around since the 60s. The first one was really set up at Xerox, and it was Black workers coming together to talk about issues and tensions in the workplace based on race and the civil rights movement. So the purpose of an ERG is to provide support and help and in personal and career development. It also creates a safe space where employees can bring their whole selves to the table, because oftentimes people who are part of a minority group don't feel like they can talk about their experience because it's not the experience of most of the people in the group. And so this has birthed the process in businesses and organizations of the employee resource group and ERGs. And now they're in successful organizations. There's all kinds of ERGs. Allies can also be invited to join an ERG to support their colleagues. But the fundamental foundational components of an ERG are that they're voluntary. Nobody's required to join an ERG. You join if you want to. They're led by employees, not by management. They also foster diversity and inclusion, and they align with the organization's values. Now, this is getting so tricky in our cultural environment right now because of how so many things are going on that organizational values are not necessarily in alignment with their workforce's values. And what does that mean? That is what's fueling and feeding the Great Resignation. So people quitting their jobs. They're not just quitting their jobs because, oh, I don't want to work. Oh, I don't, like this person at work. They're leaving because their values don't align with their organization's values. What we say is be a Jedi warrior. Belonging, equity, access, justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Be a Jedi warrior. Because including diversity and adding diversity to the workforce enhances and increases revenue, encourages more innovation in the workforce. Because when you have different perspectives and you start to put those together in a collaborative way, guess what? We get better ideas. And millennials and Gen Zs actively avoid companies without diverse workforces. So they go in looking right off the bat, which doesn't necessarily always occur to management, that they're also thinking about where they want to be and what they want their workforce to look like. So companies that have a diverse workforce contribute to the overall well-being of their own success, their own production, their own engagement at work, their own revenue coming in for their business. So it's so important, not just on a personal level to be inclusive, but also on a business level. When we look at investing in work-life balance and well-being and mental health, it's interesting because baby boomers would have never thought to say, my mental health is really important at work. And when they were surveyed, only 31% even mentioned mental health in the survey. But then slowly but surely, Gen X comes along and then they said, 41% consider work-life balance important and that they think that mental health should be in the workplace. Millennials come along, 51%, and they shifted the work-life balance to not be work-life balance, to be life-work balance. So now they're prioritizing life over work or equal to work, and that mental health is absolutely critical to the workplace. And last but not least, we have Gen Z, and they're 66% say life-work balance is critical to my workplace choice, and mental health is at the top of the list in terms of what they care about in their company. If a company does not, this is what a Gen Z person would say. If my company doesn't care about my mental health and well-being, then I don't want to work for them. Because if I don't have my mental health and well-being needs met, then I'm not going to be the best employee that I can be in the first place. So that's a massive shift. So in closing, mental health matters more than ever to the success or failure of a business or organization. Understanding the importance of mental health in the workplace is the starting point.